The days following Marco's betrayal were some of the most tense Adrian had ever experienced. Every member of Luca's organization was on edge. Security patrols doubled throughout the estate. Communication channels were changed daily. Meetings were held in different locations to prevent surveillance. Yet despite all the precautions, a sense of unease lingered over the mansion like a storm cloud refusing to move on. Marco had escaped with valuable information, and everyone knew he would deliver it directly to the Valente syndicate. Adrian spent most of his time in the operations center reviewing intelligence reports and helping identify possible targets before the syndicate could strike. The work kept him busy, but it also gave him something unexpected: a closer look at Luca's world. He watched the Mafia boss interact with his people and found himself increasingly confused. Luca wasn't the tyrant Adrian had imagined for years. He knew the names of every employee. He checked on injured guards personally. He made sure families of fallen associates received financial support. None of it erased the crimes connected to his organization, but it complicated Adrian's view of him. One evening, while reviewing surveillance footage alone, Adrian noticed Luca enter the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without a word, he placed one beside him. "You look exhausted," Luca said. Adrian accepted the cup reluctantly. "I've been trying to stop a criminal empire." Luca smirked. "Which one?" Adrian rolled his eyes despite himself. To his surprise, Luca laughed softly. It was the first genuine laugh Adrian had heard from him. The sound caught him off guard. For a brief moment, the tension between them eased. Then Adrian realized something unsettling. He no longer hated being in the same room as Luca. The realization disturbed him far more than he cared to admit. 2 nights later, a new lead arrived from one of Luca's informants. Intelligence suggested that the Valente syndicate was using an abandoned shipping warehouse near the harbor as a temporary operations center. It could contain records, financial data, or information about the trafficking network. Luca immediately assembled a small team to investigate. Adrian insisted on joining despite strong objections from nearly everyone present. "You're a prosecutor, not a field operative," one security officer argued. "And yet I've been shot at twice this week," Adrian replied. "I think I've earned participation." Luca studied him for several seconds before finally agreeing. Under the cover of darkness, they traveled to the harbor. The warehouse stood alone near the water, surrounded by rusted shipping containers and abandoned machinery. Waves crashed against nearby docks while fog drifted through the area. The team moved carefully through the shadows. At first, the building appeared empty. Then they discovered evidence of recent activity: computers, communication equipment, and files scattered across workstations. Adrian quickly began photographing documents while technicians copied digital records. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. A gunshot. One of the windows exploded inward. More shots followed. "Ambush!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted instantly. Armed syndicate members poured into the area from multiple directions. The investigation team scrambled for cover as bullets tore through crates and equipment. Adrian ducked behind a steel container while trying to protect the collected evidence. The attackers had clearly known they were coming. Someone must have anticipated the operation. The firefight intensified. Amid the confusion, Adrian noticed a gunman moving into position above him on a metal catwalk. The man raised his weapon and took aim directly at Adrian's exposed position. There wasn't enough time to react. Before the gunman could fire, another shot rang out. The attacker staggered backward and collapsed from the catwalk. Adrian turned in shock. Luca stood several meters away with his weapon still raised. Once again, he had saved Adrian's life. "Move!" Luca shouted. Adrian didn't hesitate. Together they pushed deeper into the warehouse, while security teams fought to secure an escape route. Eventually they reached a side exit leading toward the docks. The rest of the team followed moments later carrying the recovered evidence. They escaped aboard several waiting vehicles just as reinforcements from the syndicate arrived. Hours later, back at the mansion, the adrenaline had finally begun to fade. Most of the team was busy analyzing the data recovered from the warehouse. Adrian stepped onto a balcony overlooking the ocean, hoping the fresh air would clear his thoughts. To his surprise, Luca was already there. For several minutes neither man spoke. The sound of waves crashing below filled the silence. Finally Adrian broke it. "You saved me again." Luca kept his eyes on the horizon. "You would have done the same." Adrian wasn't sure that was true. Luca turned toward him. The moonlight softened the hard edges of his face. "You're important to this investigation," he said. Adrian laughed quietly. "That's not the reason." Luca's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Neither looked away. The air between them suddenly felt charged with something neither wanted to acknowledge. Then Luca stepped closer. Not enough to touch. Just enough to make Adrian's pulse quicken. For the first time since this strange alliance began, silence no longer felt comfortable. It felt dangerous. Neither man spoke about what had changed between them that night. But both knew something had cracked. The walls built from years of hatred and distrust were beginning to break apart. And once broken, they might never be rebuilt. The evidence recovered from the harbor warehouse proved more valuable than anyone expected. Over the next several days, analysts worked around the clock decrypting files and organizing records. The information revealed financial routes, safe houses, corrupt officials, and communication channels connected to the Valente syndicate. For the first time, Adrian and Luca possessed enough evidence to seriously threaten the organization. Unfortunately, their enemies quickly realized it as well. Reports began arriving from multiple sources indicating unusual movement throughout the city. Syndicate operatives were abandoning known locations, destroying records, and relocating assets. They knew someone was closing in. Adrian spent nearly every waking hour helping organize the information. The work was exhausting, but it gave him purpose. More importantly, it distracted him from the increasingly complicated feelings he had developed toward Luca. The men still represented everything Adrian had spent years fighting against. Yet every day made it harder to view him as a simple villain. Late one evening, Adrian finally stepped away from the operations center to clear his head. He left the mansion grounds with a small security detail despite Luca's objections. Just a short drive, Adrian had promised. "I need some air." Luca reluctantly agreed, though his expression suggested he disliked the idea. Adrian traveled to a quiet seaside cafe located several kilometers from the estate. For the first time in weeks, he felt almost normal. He sat near a window overlooking the water, enjoying the rare moment of peace. It lasted less than 20 minutes. The cafe doors suddenly burst open. Several armed men wearing civilian clothing entered. Their movements were too coordinated to be ordinary criminals. Adrian recognized the danger instantly. He reached for his phone, but one of the attackers was already moving toward him. Outside, gunfire erupted as his security team attempted to respond. Customers screamed and scattered. Tables overturned. Before Adrian could escape, something struck the back of his head. Pain exploded through his vision. The world tilted sideways. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was someone saying, "The boss wants him alive." When Adrian regained consciousness, everything hurt. His head throbbed. His wrists were restrained behind a metal chair. A single overhead light illuminated the room while the rest remained hidden in shadow. For several seconds, he struggled to remember what had happened. Then the memories returned. The cafe. The attack. The kidnapping. Adrian forced himself to remain calm as he examined his surroundings. The room appeared to be part of an abandoned industrial building. Concrete walls surrounded him. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. There were no windows and only one visible exit. The door eventually opened. A tall man entered accompanied by 2 armed guards. Adrian immediately recognized him from intelligence photographs. Vittorio Valente, leader of the syndicate. The man smiled coldly before pulling up a chair. "Prosecutor Reyes," he said. "We've been trying to meet for some time." Adrian remained silent. Vittorio seemed amused. "You know, this entire situation could have been avoided if you had simply minded your own business." Adrian stared at him. "Human trafficking is my business." The smile vanished. Vittorio leaned forward. "And now you've become a problem." Over the next hour, Vittorio revealed enough information to confirm Adrian's worst fears. The syndicate's influence reached far beyond the city. Politicians, business executives, and law enforcement officials across multiple countries were involved. The trafficking operation generated enormous profits, protected by layers of corruption. Anyone who threatened it disappeared. Adrian listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. Vittorio eventually stood. "Luca Moretti has interfered for too long," he said. "But you're the leverage I need." Adrian frowned. "What are you talking about?" Vittorio's smile returned. "We're going to find out exactly how much Luca values your life." Back at the mansion, chaos erupted the moment news of Adrian's kidnapping arrived. Security personnel flooded the operations center while intelligence teams scrambled to trace his location. Luca listened silently as reports came in. Witness statements, vehicle descriptions, surveillance footage. Every piece of information painted the same picture. The abduction had been carefully planned. Vittorio's people had monitored Adrian's movements, identified weaknesses in his security, and struck with precision. One of Luca's advisors cautiously approached. "We believe the syndicate wants to negotiate." Luca's expression darkened. "This isn't a negotiation." Hours later, his prediction proved correct. A video message arrived through an encrypted channel. The footage showed Adrian restrained inside a dimly lit room. Though visibly injured, he remained conscious. Vittorio stepped into frame beside him. "Good evening, Luca," he said calmly. "I have something that belongs to you." Every person in the operations center fell silent. Vittorio continued. "Tomorrow night. Midnight. Pier 17. Come alone." He paused before adding, "Or the prosecutor dies." The video ended abruptly. A heavy silence settled over the room. Luca stared at the dark screen for several seconds. His advisors immediately began arguing against the demand. It was obviously a trap. Vittorio would never honor any agreement. Going alone would be suicide. Luca ignored every warning. His gaze remained fixed on the screen where Adrian's image had disappeared moments earlier. Finally, he spoke. "Prepare the vehicles." One of the advisors stepped forward. "Luca, you can't be serious." Luca turned toward him. The look in his eyes silenced the entire room. "I'm bringing him home." For the first time since Adrian entered his life, Luca stopped pretending his concern was purely strategic. Everyone in the room understood the truth. The prosecutor had become more than an ally, more than an asset. And Luca Moretti was prepared to go to war to get him back. The hours leading up to midnight felt endless. Luca's advisors continued arguing against the rescue mission. But it was obvious their efforts were pointless. Once Luca made a decision, changing his mind was nearly impossible. The operations center became a hive of activity. Surveillance drones were deployed. Intelligence teams monitored communications across the city. Security personnel checked weapons, vehicles, and emergency routes. Officially, Luca intended to follow Vittorio's instructions and arrive alone at Pier 17. Unofficially, he was preparing something very different. Large digital maps covered the screens throughout the room, displaying every warehouse, access road, and shipping container surrounding the harbor. Intelligence suggested Vittorio had converted the abandoned port district into a temporary fortress. Armed guards occupied rooftops. Snipers monitored likely approach routes. Escape vehicles were hidden nearby. The syndicate clearly expected resistance. Luca studied the information without speaking. Every scenario pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution disguised as one. Vittorio wanted Luca dead. Adrian was simply bait. One of the analysts finally located the building where Adrian was being held. The structure sat at the far edge of the harbor, isolated from most of the syndicate's defensive positions. The discovery created an opportunity. A dangerous one, but an opportunity nonetheless. Luca immediately divided his forces. One team would create a diversion at the pier while a smaller unit attempted to extract Adrian. Several advisors objected. The plan carried enormous risks. If either operation failed, both Luca and Adrian could be lost. Luca listened patiently before responding. If we do nothing, Adrian dies. No one argued after that. Deep down, everyone understood this mission had already become personal. Luca wasn't acting like a crime boss protecting an asset. He was acting like a man trying to save someone he cared about. Meanwhile, Adrian remained imprisoned inside the industrial complex. Time passed slowly inside the small concrete room. His hands were still restrained, and armed guards monitored him constantly. Yet despite his situation, he remained focused. During every conversation and every movement through the facility, he gathered information. He memorized routes, counted personnel, and identified security weaknesses. Vittorio had underestimated him. The syndicate leader assumed Adrian was helpless. Instead, the prosecutor was quietly preparing for any chance to escape. Late that evening, Vittorio returned. Unlike previous visits, he appeared confident, almost cheerful. "Tonight will be memorable," he announced. Adrian remained silent. Vittorio laughed softly. "Luca is coming." Adrian's heart tightened. He had suspected as much. Luca was stubborn enough to walk directly into a trap if he believed someone needed saving. Vittorio leaned closer. "You know what's funny? I've spent years fighting Luca Moretti. I've bribed his people, attacked his businesses, and tried to destroy everything he built." He smiled coldly. "But I never found his weakness until now." Adrian met his gaze. "You don't know him as well as you think." Vittorio's expression darkened. "We'll see." Moments later, alarms began sounding throughout the complex. Guards rushed through hallways. Radio communications exploded with urgent messages. Vittorio frowned. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Another guard entered the room. "Boss, we're under attack." For the first time, genuine surprise appeared on Vittorio's face. Somewhere outside, gunfire erupted. Then came explosions. The rescue had begun. The harbor transformed into a battlefield. Luca's diversionary force struck the syndicates. Defenses with overwhelming aggression. Explosions illuminated the night sky while gunfire echoed across the waterfront. Syndicate operatives rushed to defend key positions, exactly as Luca had predicted. While attention focused on the pier, a smaller team penetrated deeper into the industrial district. Luca led them personally. Against every recommendation, he refused to stay behind. The closer they moved toward Adrian's location, the heavier the resistance became. Armed guards appeared from warehouses, rooftops, and loading docks. Several fierce firefights erupted throughout the complex. Yet Luca continued pushing forward. Nothing seemed capable of stopping him. Eventually they reached the building where Adrian was being held. Inside, Vittorio was already preparing to relocate his prisoner. The moment Adrian heard familiar gunfire approaching, he knew exactly who had arrived. Moments later, the door exploded inward. Smoke filled the room. Guards shouted. Chaos erupted. Through the confusion, Adrian saw Luca. Their eyes met across the room. Relief washed through both of them before either could hide it. "Took you long enough," Adrian said. Luca almost smiled. You sound disappointed. Before either could say more, additional gunfire erupted from the corridor. The battle wasn't over. Together they fought their way through the facility while Luca's team secured an escape route. Outside, the larger conflict continued raging. Syndicate forces and Moretti soldiers clashed throughout the harbor. Vehicles burned. Warehouses exploded. Years of hidden conflict had finally erupted into open war. Yet amidst the violence, a more important truth emerged. Adrian had spent years believing Luca Moretti was his greatest enemy. Now, as they ran side by side through a battlefield, risking their lives for each other, that belief felt impossible to maintain. Whatever this relationship had become, it was no longer built on hatred. And both men were beginning to realize it. The battle at the harbor lasted until dawn. By the time the gunfire finally faded, much of the industrial district had been reduced to wreckage. Emergency vehicles flooded the area while both the Moretti organization and the Valente syndicate retreated to regroup. Luca's forces had successfully rescued Adrian, but the victory came at a cost. Several loyal members of Luca's organization had been injured, and valuable intelligence had been lost during the chaos. Worse, Vittorio Valente had escaped. Back at the mansion, doctors treated minor injuries while exhausted analysts worked to assess the damage. Adrian sat in the medical wing, a fresh bandage wrapped around his shoulder after a close encounter during the rescue. Although physically exhausted, his mind refused to rest. Everything had changed. The evidence collected over the previous weeks now painted a complete picture of the trafficking network. They had names, financial records, locations, and connections to high-ranking officials. For the first time, Adrian possessed enough proof to destroy the syndicate permanently. Yet another problem remained. Much of the evidence also implicated Luca. Not in the trafficking operation, but in countless other criminal activities connected to his organization. The law was clear. If Adrian presented everything he knew, Luca would almost certainly face arrest. The realization weighed heavily on him. Just weeks earlier, the decision would have been easy. Now it felt impossible. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Luca entered quietly. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them had changed over time. It no longer felt hostile. Instead, it carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Luca glanced at the medical reports before looking at Adrian. "How are you feeling?" Adrian almost laughed. "Kidnapped, shot at, nearly blown up." He paused. "I've had better weeks." To his surprise, Luca smiled. The expression faded quickly. Something about him seemed different. More serious. More distant. Adrian immediately noticed it. Later that evening, Luca requested a private meeting in his study. Adrian arrived to find several folders spread across the large wooden desk. The atmosphere felt unusually heavy. Without a word, Luca handed him the first file. Adrian opened it and immediately froze. Inside were detailed records of the Moretti organization's operations. Financial accounts. Property ownership documents. Names of key associates. Evidence that prosecutors had spent years trying to obtain. Adrian slowly looked up. "What is this?" Luca leaned back in his chair. The truth. Adrian stared at him in disbelief. The files contained enough information to dismantle a large portion of Luca's criminal empire. Why are you giving me this? Luca remained silent for several moments before answering. Because this has to end. The words hit harder than Adrian expected. What are you talking about? Luca stood and walked toward the window overlooking the ocean. For years, I've convinced myself I could control everything. That I could protect people by staying inside this world. He laughed bitterly. Maybe I was wrong. Adrian felt an uncomfortable knot forming in his chest. Luca. Luca turned toward him. For the first time since they met, there was no mask. No calculated confidence. No carefully controlled expression. Just honesty. The trafficking network will collapse once the evidence becomes public. Vittorio's allies will fall with him. His gaze never left Adrian's. But none of that changes who I am. Adrian didn't know how to respond. Luca continued. You're a prosecutor. You believe in the law. He nodded toward the files. When this is over, you'll have everything you need. Adrian suddenly understood where the conversation was heading. And he hated it. The following morning, events moved quickly. Using evidence recovered from both the syndicate and the Moretti organization, law enforcement agencies launched coordinated raids across the city. Corrupt politicians were arrested. Financial assets were frozen. Safe houses were seized. News channels erupted with breaking reports as the largest criminal investigation in the cities. History unfolded. Meanwhile, intelligence confirmed Vittorio's location. Cornered and running out of options, the syndicate leader prepared to flee the country. A final operation was organized to stop him. Adrian expected Luca to participate. Instead, the Mafia boss made a different decision. Hours before the operation began, he voluntarily walked into a federal courthouse accompanied by his attorneys. The news spread instantly. Luca Moretti had surrendered. By the time Adrian arrived, reporters surrounded the building while police secured the area. Inside, Luca sat calmly in an interview room waiting for processing. Their eyes met as Adrian entered. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Adrian closed the door behind him. You planned this, he said quietly. Luca nodded. The moment I handed you those files. Adrian felt anger rise inside him. You don't get to decide everything yourself. A faint smile appeared on Luca's face. Someone has to. Adrian looked away, struggling to control emotions he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Luca's surrender solved countless problems. It protected the investigation. It ensured the evidence would hold up in court. It gave Adrian the opportunity to fulfill his duty. Yet none of those facts made the situation easier. Luca stood and stepped closer. You once told me justice mattered. Adrian remained silent. Now you have a chance to prove it. For a moment, neither moved. Then officers entered to escort Luca away. As they led him toward the holding cells, Adrian watched helplessly. Years ago, this was exactly what he had wanted. The arrest of Luca Moretti. The downfall of a criminal empire. The victory he had spent his career pursuing. Yet standing there now, it felt less like a triumph and more like losing something he never expected to find. Outside, the city celebrated the collapse of corruption. Inside, Adrian faced the most painful truth of all. He had finally succeeded in bringing down Luca Moretti. And somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with him. The trial became the most talked about event in the country. News channels provided non-stop coverage. Reporters crowded courthouse steps from sunrise until midnight. Citizens gathered outside hoping to witness history unfold. The collapse of the Valente syndicate had exposed a vast network of corruption, stretching through government offices, law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and private corporations. Dozens of powerful figures were arrested. Others fled before they could be charged. Entire careers and political dynasties crumbled within weeks. Yet despite the scale of the scandal, public attention remained fixed on one man, Luca Moretti. The infamous Mafia boss sat at the center of the largest criminal case the city had ever seen. Every day, Adrian entered the courtroom carrying evidence that Luca himself had provided. Financial records, property documents, witness testimonies. Years earlier, obtaining even a fraction of that information would have been considered impossible. Now it sat neatly organized in evidence folders waiting to be presented before the court. Professionally, Adrian should have felt victorious. This was the outcome he had dedicated nearly 7 years of his life to achieving. Yet every time he looked toward the defense table, the feeling disappeared. Luca never tried to deny responsibility for his actions. He never attacked witnesses or manipulated proceedings. Instead, he cooperated fully with investigators and continued providing information that helped dismantle remaining criminal operations. His cooperation accelerated dozens of arrests and prevented several key members of the trafficking network from escaping justice. The public saw a criminal finally facing consequences. Adrian saw something more complicated. He saw a man willingly sacrificing everything he had built to ensure the truth emerged. That realization made every day of the trial harder than the one before. Somewhere along the way, the line between duty and personal feeling had become dangerously blurred. Weeks later, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every available seat. Families of victims sat quietly in the front rows. Government officials observed from behind security barriers. The atmosphere felt heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew the verdict would shape the city's future. Adrian sat silently while the judge reviewed the final findings. The evidence presented throughout the trial had been overwhelming. The Valente syndicate was officially declared a criminal enterprise responsible for trafficking, corruption, murder, and organized crime across multiple jurisdictions. Numerous accomplices received lengthy prison sentences. Several high-ranking officials were permanently removed from office. Then attention shifted toward Luca. The courtroom fell silent. The judge acknowledged both the crimes connected to the Moretti organization and Luca's extraordinary cooperation throughout the investigation. Without his testimony and evidence, many of the trafficking network's leaders would have escaped prosecution. The decision reflected both realities. Luca was found guilty of multiple criminal offenses connected to his organization. However, his cooperation, voluntary surrender, and assistance in dismantling the syndicate significantly reduced the sentence. A murmur spread through the courtroom as the ruling was announced. Adrian barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Luca. Throughout the entire proceeding, the Mafia boss showed little emotion. He accepted the judgment calmly, almost as if he had expected it from the beginning. When the judge finished speaking, officers approached to escort him away. For the first time that day, Luca looked toward Adrian. Their eyes met across the crowded courtroom. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Both understood what that moment meant. Justice had been served. Yet neither felt victorious. Several years later, the city looked very different. Corruption had declined dramatically. New leadership had transformed government agencies once controlled by criminal influence. Businesses operated without fear of extortion. The trafficking network had been completely dismantled. And hundreds of victims had been rescued through ongoing investigations. Adrian continued working as a prosecutor, eventually earning a reputation as one of the most respected legal professionals in the country. Yet despite everything he achieved, a part of him remained tied to the past. One autumn afternoon, Adrian received unexpected news. Luca Moretti had been granted release after serving his reduced sentence and assisting authorities in several ongoing investigations. Adrian didn't know how to feel. For years, he had imagined the day Luca would walk free. Now that it had arrived, uncertainty replaced expectation. Later that evening, Adrian stood on a quiet seaside promenade watching waves roll toward the shore. The sky glowed orange and gold as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Footsteps approached from behind. Adrian didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Silence settled between them for several moments. Then a familiar voice spoke. "Still working too much?" Adrian laughed softly. "Still making terrible first impressions?" Luca smiled. The years had changed both of them. Yet somehow, the connection remained. Neither knew what the future would look like. Too much had happened. Too many mistakes had been made. But for the first time, they were free to discover the answer. The war was over. The secrets were gone. There were no enemies left hiding in the shadows. Only two men standing beside the ocean, looking toward a future neither had expected. As the last light of day faded beyond the horizon, Adrian realized something important. Their story had never really been about crime, power, or justice. It had always been about choice. And now, for the first time, the choice was theirs.
Subscribe to listen more stories like this.